If you've ever been told that loving too much is a flaw, this story will feel uncomfortably familiar. Because sometimes, the most painful breakups don't happen with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes, they happen in silence. While you're still married. The words landed softly, almost casually, which somehow made them worse. "Can you stop doing all this?" my husband said. "It's awkward." He was standing across the kitchen from me, flipping through the handmade photo book I'd spent months creating. Thick pages. Carefully chosen memories. Little notes tucked into the margins. I'd even wrapped it in leather because he once said it made things feel important. Apparently, this didn't. The candles I'd lit were still burning behind me. Dinner was finished. I was wearing the red dress he used to love before he stopped noticing things like that. And as he sighed and closed the album, I felt something in my chest shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. My name is Judith. I was 31 years old, 5 years married, and standing in my own home realizing I had just embarrassed myself by loving someone who no longer valued it. I smiled, of course. I always smiled. I apologized, too. I told him I understood. Isai di digone overboard. Then I blew out the candles, cleared the table, and slid the album onto a shelf in the hallway closet. It's still there. Untouched. That night didn't end in a fight. It didn't end in tears. It ended in something quieter. The realization that I had been shrinking for years, and no one had noticed, especially not him. The next morning, I woke up early like I always did. But instead of making coffee, packing his lunch, and lining up his vitamins on the counter, I got dressed and left for work. When he texted me asking where his lunch was, I told him I was running late. It was a small lie. And it felt enormous. Over the next few weeks, I began observing myself like a stranger. I noticed how much energy I'd been spending managing someone else's comfort. How often I adjusted my tone, my enthusiasm, my affection, just enough not to irritate him. I wasn't being myself. I was performing a version of love he could tolerate. I remembered the weekend trips he barely looked up during. The surprise tickets he complained about. The parties I planned that he said made people uncomfortable. Every memory felt different once I stopped excusing them. What hurt most wasn't his indifference. It was how invisible my absence became when I stopped trying. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't notice I'd stopped reaching for his hand or saying, "I love you" first. The warmth drained from the house slowly, and he walked through it like nothing had changed. That was when I understood something terrifying. He hadn't loved me. He had loved what I provided. And the moment I stopped providing it, there was nothing left holding us together. I didn't leave. Not yet. I didn't confront him. I just stopped. Stopped planning. Stopped hoping. Stopped begging silently for crumbs of affection. I wanted to see what would happen if I removed myself from the equation. And what happened next would change everything. Because when you stop giving love to someone who's never earned it, their reaction tells you everything you need to know, and his was just beginning. When I stopped trying, nothing exploded. No accusations. No confrontation. No sudden concern. That was the first thing that scared me. The house simply kept moving. Mornings still came. Evenings still passed. Nathan still expected dinner, still talked about his job, still complained about traffic and coworkers like nothing had shifted beneath his feet. And yet everything had. I noticed it in the smallest details. I no longer reminded him of appointments. I stopped asking follow-up questions when he vented. I didn't rearrange my schedule to match his moods. I wasn't cold. I wasn't cruel. I was polite, calm, present. Just no longer overextending myself to make him feel comfortable. At first, he seemed relieved. There was no pressure to engage. No expectation to reciprocate affection. No obligation to pretend interest when he disappeared into his phone for hours. He came home, ate, retreated into his routines, and I let him. The irony was sharp. The less I gave, the easier his life became. I started to realize how much emotional labor I had been carrying alone. I'd been filling every silence, smoothing every edge, cushioning every discomfort so he never had to feel the absence of connection. And now that I wasn't doing it anymore, the emptiness was exposed, but only to me. I began keeping a journal. Nothing poetic. Just observations. He didn't ask where I went tonight. He didn't notice I didn't say good night. I wonder how long it would take him to notice if I disappeared emotionally completely. Weeks passed. Then a month. Still nothing. That was when the grief set in. Not dramatic grief, but the kind that settles into your bones. The kind that comes from realizing you've been alone far longer than you admitted to yourself. My best friend noticed before he did. We were sitting across from each other at lunch, and she kept studying my face like she was trying to read something written between the lines. Finally, she asked if I was okay. I told her I was tired. She didn't argue. She just nodded and said, "When you're ready to talk, I'm here." That kindness almost broke me. At home, Nathan's expectations remained intact. Clean house. Food ready. Emotional availability on demand. He still assumed I existed in orbit around him, adjusting my gravity to keep him comfortable. What he didn't notice was how much quieter I had become. I stopped reaching for his hand. Stopped filling pauses with conversation. Stopped offering reassurance he never asked for but always consumed. And still, nothing. I started to ask myself questions I'd avoided for years. Had he ever loved me? Or had he simply loved the way I made his life easier? Looking back, the signs were everywhere. The cancelled plans. The glazed-over expressions when I spoke. The way my excitement seemed to exhaust him. I told myself this was normal. That long marriages settled into something calmer, quieter. But calm isn't the same as empty. One night, sitting across from him at dinner in complete silence, it hit me. If I stopped existing emotionally, his life would barely change. And that realization was more painful than any argument we'd never had. I wasn't trying to punish him. I wasn't playing a game. I was testing a truth I was terrified to confirm. And slowly, day by day, the answer became impossible to ignore. Without my effort, there was nothing holding us together. But just when I accepted that he might never notice my absence, something shifted, and his confusion was only the beginning. Nathan didn't notice my silence right away. But when he did, it didn't arrive as concern. It arrived as confusion. It started subtly. He lingered in doorways longer than usual. He hovered in the kitchen while I cooked, opening the fridge without taking anything out, as if waiting for something to happen. Sometimes he'd start a sentence and abandon it halfway through, like the thought slipped away before he could grab it. At first, I almost felt bad for him. Almost. For years, I had been the one filling space. Emotionally, verbally, energetically. If a room felt awkward, I smoothed it. If a conversation stalled, I revived it. If silence threatened discomfort, I rescued us both from it. Now I wasn't rescuing anything. And Nathan didn't know what to do with that. He started asking surface-level questions. Work okay? Everything fine? I answered honestly and briefly. Yes, fine. Same as usual. Because it was. The difference was that I no longer volunteered pieces of myself. He never held gently. There was one evening about 6 weeks after the anniversary. We were sitting in the living room, the television murmuring in the background. He muted it suddenly and turned toward me like someone interrupting their own thoughts. "You've been different," he said. "Are you mad at me?" I looked at him for a moment before answering. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I realized something important. This was the first time he'd noticed a change in me. And it wasn't because he missed me. It was because his comfort had been disrupted. "No," I said. "I'm not mad." That answer seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. "Then what is it?" he asked. "You just seem distant." He shrugged lightly. "I guess I've been thinking." "About what?" "About how I've been lonely for years while sharing a bed with you. About how I apologized for loving you. About how my absence barely registered until it inconvenienced you. But I didn't say any of that." "About us," I said instead. He nodded, like that made sense, but his expression didn't change. There was no curiosity there. No urgency. Just unease, like someone noticing a noise in the house and hoping it stops on its own. The conversation drifted. He unmuted the TV. Life resumed. That was when something inside me hardened. Not into anger. Into clarity. I stopped waiting for him to reach me. I realized I had been living on hope for years. Hope that one day he'd wake up and see me. Hope that if I explained myself better, loved him softer, asked for less, he'd meet me in the middle. But hope is exhausting when you're the only one carrying it. I thought about all the moments I'd minimized myself to keep the peace. All the times I'd told myself I was too sensitive or expecting too much. I'd mistaken emotional neglect for normalcy because it was easier than facing the truth. And the truth was this. Intimacy wasn't something Nathan avoided accidentally. He avoided it because it required effort, and effort had never been his language. The more I withdrew, the more restless he became. Not affectionate. Not reflective. Just unsettled. He was losing something he never believed he could lose. And for the first time I stopped feeling guilty about that. Because I wasn't withholding love to punish him. I was protecting myself from disappearing completely. I didn't know yet what this would lead to. I didn't know if the marriage would survive. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. He could never go back to being invisible. And when he finally asked the question I'd been waiting months to hear, I realized the answer would change both of us forever. It took nearly 3 months for him to finally ask the question directly. Not gently. Not tenderly. But cautiously. Like someone approaching a problem they hoped would solve itself. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch on a quiet Sunday evening. The room smelled faintly of detergent and dust, the kind of neutral scent that comes from living in a place where no one bothers to make it warm anymore. The television was on, but neither of us was watching. He muted it and turned to face me. "What's going on with you?" he asked. "You've been off for a while now. Is there something you want to talk about?" I studied his face longer than necessary. This was the moment I'd imagined in a dozen different ways. In some versions, he sounded worried. In others, apologetic. In none of them did he sound like this. Confused, inconvenienced, almost annoyed. "Yes," I said slowly. "There is." His shoulders relaxed a fraction, as if he was relieved there was a concrete issue to address. "Okay. What is it? Do you remember what you said to me on our anniversary?" He frowned. "Not really. What are you talking about?" "The photo album," he said. "The one Uno made." His eyes shifted. "I told you not to make such a big deal out of things. I was just being honest." "You told me my love was embarrassing," I replied. "You made me feel small for caring." He sighed, already defensive. "I didn't mean it like that. You know how I am. I was stressed. You're reading too much into it." That was when it hit me. He genuinely believed this conversation was about a single moment. He had no idea it was about years. "I didn't change because of one comment," I said quietly. "I changed because that comment confirmed something I'd been trying not to see." "And what's that?" he asked. "That I've been carrying this marriage by myself." He stared at me, stunned. "That's not fair. I work hard. I provide. I'm here, aren't I?" "Yes," I said. "You're here. But you're not with me." He scoffed. "So what? Now I'm a bad husband because I'm not emotional enough?" "No," I replied. "You're a bad partner because you never asked if I was okay, and when I tried to tell you, you didn't listen." The room went quiet. I could see him struggling to reconcile this version of reality with the one he'd always believed. In his world, everything had been fine. Comfortable. Functional. He had never considered the cost. "I didn't know you felt this way," he said finally. "That's because you never wanted to know," I answered. "It was easier to let me do all the work." His jaw tightened. "So what do you want from me now?" That question revealed everything. Not how can I fix this? Not how did I hurt you? But what do you want from me? As if love were a transaction he needed clearer instructions for. "I want a partner," I said. "Someone who shows up without being asked." "Someone who wants to know me, not just live next to me." He shook his head. "You're acting like I've done nothing." "You've done the bare minimum," I replied. And I convinced myself it was enough because I was afraid of what it would mean if it wasn't. Silence stretched between us, heavy and unforgiving. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across his face. Not fear of losing me, but fear of being exposed. Of realizing he might actually have to change. "What happens if I can't be what you want?" he asked. I looked at him, calm in a way that surprised even me. "Then nothing changes," I said. "Because nothing already has." And when he finally tried to fix things, I realized his efforts weren't about love at all. They were about control. The change didn't happen overnight. At first, it came in gestures so small they almost felt accidental. A text during the day asking how work was. An awkward attempt at conversation over dinner. A sudden "love you" dropped into the room like an afterthought, as if he'd remembered it was something husbands were supposed to say. If this had happened years earlier, I might have clung to it. I would have told myself this was growth. That this was him trying. But timing matters. Because effort that shows up only after consequences appear isn't love, it's panic. A week after our conversation, he came home with flowers. Grocery store flowers. Still wrapped in plastic, the receipt tucked into the side like an afterimage of obligation. He set them on the counter and waited. I thanked him. Genuinely. Politely. He watched my reaction too closely, like someone waiting for a machine to start working again after hitting the right button. What? He asked. You don't like them? They're fine, I said. Thank you. That answer frustrated him more than anger would have. The next attempt was dinner. He suggested a restaurant he liked, then spent most of the meal scrolling on his phone while I ate in silence. Halfway through, he reached across the table, squeezed my hand and said, "See? We're trying. Trying. The word echoed in my head long after we got home." He started saying it often after that. I'm trying. I don't know what else you want. I'm doing my best. But his best still required reminders. Still lacked curiosity. Still centered himself. I watched him closely, not with hope, but with clarity. His gestures weren't about understanding me. They were about restoring his comfort. He wanted the version of our marriage where I handled the emotional weight and he benefited from it without effort. He wanted things to go back to normal. But normal was what broke me. One night, after another hollow attempt at connection, he snapped. Nothing I do is ever good enough for you, he said. I don't know why you're making this so hard. I looked at him and realized something painful but freeing. He wasn't trying to meet me. He was trying to quiet me. He wanted me to stop feeling. Stop asking. Stop expecting. Because if I did, he wouldn't have to confront the reality of how little he'd given. The more his frustration grew, the clearer everything became. When love is genuine, effort feels natural. It's consistent. It doesn't require instruction manuals or emotional ultimatums. What he was doing wasn't love. It was damage control. Then came the accusation. One evening out of nowhere, he asked if there was someone else. His voice was sharp, defensive, searching for a villain that wasn't him. The irony was almost laughable. He couldn't imagine a world where I left because of myself, because I'd reached a breaking point. It had to be another man. Some outside force. Anything but his own indifference. There's no one else, I said. There never was. He didn't believe me. Or maybe he did, and the truth scared him more. That night, I moved into the guest room. It wasn't dramatic. No slammed doors. Just a quiet decision to stop sharing a space with someone who had already left me emotionally years ago. He protested at first. Then sulked. Then went silent. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. But when I finally said the words he thought would never leave my mouth, his reaction proved it had always been too late. The guest room became my refuge faster than I expected. The bed was smaller. The walls were bare. But for the first time in years, I slept without tension coiled in my chest. I didn't lie awake wondering if I'd said too much, asked for too much, felt too much. There was no one beside me to disappoint, or be disappointed by. Nathan didn't know what to do with the distance. At first, he treated it like a phase. He assumed I'd cool off, get tired of being uncomfortable, and return to my place beside him. He left the door open at night, as if proximity alone might lure me back. He made comments like, "When you come back to our room." Never if. That assumption told me everything. He still believed this was about space. About moods. About me being difficult. Not about years of erosion. A few days later, he tried again. He knocked on the guest room door one evening and asked if we could talk. I said yes. We sat on opposite sides of the bed, the distance between us deliberate. "I don't like this," he said. "It feels extreme." I nodded. "It does." "So when is this going to end?" he asked. There it was again. The expectation that I would set a timeline for my own unhappiness. That I would tell him how long I needed before resuming the role he preferred. I don't know, I said honestly. He frowned. That's not fair. He almost laughed. Fair. I repeated. You think this is unfair? He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. I just don't understand why you're doing this, he said. We could fix things if you just meet me halfway. The words settled heavily in the room. I've been standing in the middle for years, I replied. You're just noticing now because I stopped walking toward you. That was the moment something shifted in me. I stopped trying to explain myself in ways he could accept. I stopped softening my truth to make it easier for him to swallow. I stopped negotiating my worth. Because the truth was simple. Even if he didn't like it. I wasn't asking for too much. I was asking the wrong person. The next few weeks were quiet in a way that felt final. We passed each other in hallways with polite nods. We spoke only when necessary. The house felt less like a home and more like a waiting room. Somewhere you sit until your name is called and your life changes. My friends noticed. My sister noticed. Even my mother, during a brief phone call, asked if I was happy. That question sat with me long after we hung up. Was I happy? No. But for the first time, I wasn't numb either. I started imagining a life that didn't require constant emotional translation. A life where love didn't feel like labor. Where care wasn't conditional. Where I didn't have to disappear to keep someone else comfortable. That imagination felt dangerous. And necessary. Nathan, meanwhile, grew restless. He started pacing more. Asking questions he didn't want the answers to. Making promises that sounded rehearsed. I can change, he said one night. Just tell me what to do. And that was when I realized something irreversible. If he truly wanted to change, he wouldn't need instructions. He would need awareness. And awareness was something he had avoided his entire life. I didn't say anything that night. I just nodded and went back to my room, closing the door behind me with a quiet click that felt louder than any argument. Because in that moment I knew. This wasn't about fixing a marriage anymore. It was about choosing myself. And when I finally spoke the decision out loud, he reacted exactly the way someone does when they realize control has slipped through their fingers. The night I finally said it, nothing about the evening felt important. There was no anniversary. No argument. No dramatic build-up. Just a regular weekday, the television on low volume, dishes drying in the rack. Ordinary moments have a way of carrying extraordinary endings. I walked into the living room where Nathan was sitting and said the words I'd been rehearsing silently for weeks. I don't want to be married anymore. For a second, he laughed. Not because it was funny, but because disbelief can sound like humor when the truth feels impossible. You're serious? He asked, still half smiling. Yes, I said. I am. The smile disappeared. He stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. You can't just decide that, he said. That's not how this works. I stayed calm. I'd already had the hardest conversations with myself. This one was just logistics. I've already spoken to a lawyer, I told him. I'm going to stay with a friend while we figure things out. That's when panic took over. He started talking fast. Listing reasons, excuses, promises. He said we hadn't really tried. He said couples go through phases. He said I was being impulsive. Impulsive. I thought of the years I'd spent doubting myself, shrinking my needs, swallowing disappointment. Of the careful, quiet way I'd come to this decision. Nothing about it was sudden. This isn't about one fight, I said. It's about years of feeling alone. He shook his head. I brought you flowers. I asked you to dinner. I told you I loved you. And I needed you to care, I replied. Not just react. That was the moment his voice changed. Please, he said. The word hung in the air. Un familiar entrò. Nathan never begged. He never had to. Life had always been to accommodate him. I can be better, he said. Just give me another chance. I looked at him and felt something I didn't expect. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just sadness. I gave you years of chances, I said quietly. You just didn't notice because there were no consequences. He reached for me. He stepped back. I'm not angry anymore, I continued. I'm done. That hurt him more than yelling ever could have. He started crying then, really crying. The kind that comes from realizing something is truly over. I almost wavered. Almost. But then I remembered the nights I cried alone while he slept. The times I'd begged silently for attention. The way he called my love embarrassing. Love shouldn't have to beg. I picked up my bag from the hallway. He followed me to the door, asking questions that didn't matter anymore.
Where will you go? When will you come back? Can we talk tomorrow?
I turned to face him one last time. I hope you learn from this, I said. I really do. But I can't stay and teach you how to value me. He didn't respond. He just stood there as I opened the door. The air outside felt different. Cooler, cleaner. I stepped into it without looking back. Because some endings don't need closure. They need courage. But walking away didn't bring instant relief, and what came next surprised me more than the marriage ever did. I thought leaving would feel like relief right away. That I'd step into my new life and breathe easier instantly. That the weight would fall off my shoulders the moment the door closed behind me. That's not what happened. The drive to my friend's place was quiet. No music. No tears. Just the hum of the road and a strange emptiness where certainty should have been. I wasn't questioning my decision. I was mourning the version of myself who had stayed so long believing love meant endurance. Colleen opened the door before I even knocked. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer advice. She just pulled me into a hug and held me there until my breathing slowed. That kindness undid me more than anger ever could have. That first night, I slept deeply. Not peacefully but deeply. Like my body finally had permission to rest. The next morning, reality set in. I wasn't a wife anymore. I didn't have a role to perform. No one was waiting for me to smooth their day. And that terrified me. Freedom isn't always light at first. Sometimes it feels like standing in an open field with no map, realizing you've spent years being told where to go. Nathan started calling immediately. At first, his messages were sharp and confused. He accused me of giving up. Of blindsiding him. Of ruining something that could have been fixed if I'd just been patient. I didn't respond. Then the tone shifted. He said he missed me. He said he couldn't sleep. He said the house felt wrong without me.
He promised therapy.
Change. Effort. Growth. I still didn't respond. The bargaining phase came next. Long messages outlining everything he would do differently. The husband he could be. The future he suddenly saw clearly now that I was gone. It would have been easier if those messages made me angry. Instead, they made me tired. Because every promise was a reminder. He had always been capable of effort. He just hadn't thought it was necessary until losing me became real. That wasn't love. That was fear. I turned my phone off. Days passed. Then weeks. The silence was uncomfortable. But honest. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to someone else's emotions. I was sitting with my own. I started noticing things. How my shoulders weren't constantly tense. How I didn't rehearse conversations before having them. How I could take up space without apologizing.
Small freedoms. Quiet revelations.
I found an apartment a month later. It wasn't big.
1 bedroom. Sunlight through the windows in the afternoon. Walls he could paint any color uno wanted. I cose a soft green.
Nathan always said green felt unnecessary. That first night alone, I sat on the floor eating takeout and realized something profound.
He wasn't lonely.
I had been lonely in my marriage. I had been lonely sharing a bed with someone who never reached for me emotionally. This was solitude. And solitude felt honest. Nathan kept unraveling from a distance. Friends mentioned he wasn't eating well. That the house was a mess. That he seemed lost without someone organizing his life. I felt no satisfaction in that. Just confirmation. I had been the structure he leaned on without ever reinforcing. And now that I was gone, he was discovering the weight of standing alone. The divorce paperwork moved quickly. No kids. Clean lines. A life that dismantled easier than I expected. That scared me too. How fragile had it been all along? The final papers were signed on a quiet morning.
No dramatic courtroom moment.
Just ink on paper and the closing of a chapter that had consumed years of my life. Walking out of that building, I expected to cry. I didn't. I felt steady. Not healed. Not whole. But finally facing forward. And just when I thought the hardest part was over, he asked me one last question that forced me to confront the truth I could no longer ignore. I didn't expect to see him again so soon. But a few days after the paperwork was finalized, Nathan asked if we could talk. Just once more. Not to argue, he said.
Not tu convince me.
Just to understand. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met in a small park near the courthouse, the kind of place people pass through without really noticing.
Neutral ground.
Safe ground. He was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench with his hands clasped together like he was holding something fragile. He looked different. Not dramatically, just worn. His confidence, the thing that used to fill every room before he did, was gone. In its place was someone quieter, smaller, almost unsure of how to take up space. I've been going to therapy, he said almost immediately, like he needed me to know. A lot. I'm trying to understand why I am the way I am. I nodded. I'm glad. He talked for a while after that. About his childhood. About how closeness always felt dangerous to him. About how he learned early on that providing materially was safer than being emotionally available. I didn't know how to love the way you wanted, he said. And by the time I realized it, you were already gone. There was genuine regret in his voice.
Real awareness.
And for a brief moment, I wondered, if this version of him had existed earlier, would things have been different? Then he asked the question. Is there any chance, he said quietly, that someday, after I've worked on myself, we could try again?
The words landed gently.
Carefully. As if he were offering them with both hands. I took a breath before answering. Because this was the moment where everything I'd learned was being tested. No, I said. He flinched like the word had weight. It's not because I don't believe you can change, I continued.
Io più do.
I really do. But I can't unlearn how it felt to love you alone. He looked down at his hands.
I non hurt you.
He said. I just wish I'd realized it sooner. I wish you had too, I replied. But wishing doesn't rebuild trust. We sat there in silence for a few moments. Two people at the end of something that once felt inevitable and now felt finished. I'm sorry, he said again. I know, I answered.
And I believe you.
That surprised him. He looked up, searching my face. But being sorry doesn't undo the damage, I added. It just acknowledges it. When I stood to leave, he asked one last thing.
Do you ever miss me?
I considered the question carefully. I miss who I thought you were, I said. And I miss who I was when I believed love meant trying harder. But I don't miss the marriage. He nodded slowly, like he was filing the truth away somewhere painful but necessary. We said goodbye without touching. Walking away, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. Clarity, I was learning, is its own kind of kindness. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat on the floor with the windows open and let the quiet settle around me. Not the suffocating quiet of neglect, but the spacious kind. The kind that leaves room for something new. I realized then that healing wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about refusing to return to what broke you. And I wasn't broken anymore. What I didn't realize yet was that rebuilding myself would be harder, and more beautiful, than leaving ever was. The rebuilding didn't announce itself with confidence. It started quietly, awkwardly, like learning how to walk in a body that had been tense for years. I had space now, but space can feel overwhelming when you've spent most of your life adjusting yourself to fit someone else. The first thing I noticed was how often I apologized out of habit. Sorry for taking up time. Sorry for speaking too long. Sorry for having preferences. No one had asked me to apologize, but my body remembered the rules even when the game was over. I began undoing them slowly. I painted my apartment the colors I liked without checking if they were too much. I bought furniture because it felt comfortable, not because it matched someone else's taste. I filled the shelves with books I actually wanted to read, not ones I thought would make me seem interesting or agreeable. These choices seemed small, almost insignificant. They weren't. They were proof that I could exist without permission. I reconnected with parts of myself I had packed away years ago. I signed up for a pottery class on a whim and spent Tuesday nights covered in clay, laughing at my own clumsiness. I walked by the river on weekends without checking my phone, letting my thoughts stretch out without interruption. There was grief in these moments too.
Grief for the time I'd lost.
For the woman I might have been if I'd chosen myself sooner. But grief didn't consume me the way it once might have. It passed through me instead of settling in. Work changed too. My focus sharpened. My ideas felt clearer. Colleagues commented that I seemed lighter, more present. I realized how much mental energy I'd been spending managing emotional fallout at home. Energy that now belonged to me again.
I wasn't surviving anymore.
I was participating. Nathan faded into the background of my life gradually, the way old habits do. I heard occasional updates through mutual acquaintances. He was struggling, still trying to figure things out, still searching for something he couldn't quite name. I didn't feel responsible for that. For the first time, I understood that someone else's growth couldn't come at the expense of my own. There were lonely moments, of course. Evenings when the quiet felt sharp instead of spacious. Nights when I reached for my phone out of reflex, wanting the comfort of familiarity. But loneliness didn't scare me the way it used to. Loneliness was honest. What I'd lived with before, being unseen, unheard, emotionally dismissed, that was what had nearly erased me. One afternoon, while sitting alone in a cafe, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked different. Not younger. Not happier in an obvious way. Stronger. My posture had changed.
My eyes held something steadier.
I wasn't scanning the room for approval. I wasn't bracing for disappointment. I was just there. And for the first time in years that felt enough. I didn't rush into dating. I wasn't interested in filling space just to avoid feeling it. I wanted to know myself fully before inviting anyone else in. Because I finally understood something vital. Love isn't proven by endurance. It isn't measured by how much you can tolerate. It's revealed by how safe you feel being fully yourself. And I was done shrinking. But just when I stopped looking for love entirely, it found me in the most unexpected, uncomplicated way. I wasn't looking for anything when it happened. No intention. No strategy. No quiet hope hiding in the background. I was simply living my life. Fully, honestly, and without performing for anyone. That's when he appeared. His name was Thomas. We met in the most unremarkable way possible, which somehow made it feel safer. He worked at the university library near my apartment, and our first conversation happened over a stack of books I was checking out for my reading group. He asked what I thought of the author. Then he actually waited for the answer. That detail mattered more than I realized at the time. There was no rush between us. No charm offensive.
No intensity masquerading as connection.
Just ease. Conversation that didn't require translation. Silence that didn't feel like rejection. We started seeing each other slowly. Coffee, long walks, shared laughter over small observations most people missed. He remembered things I said without trying. He followed up on thoughts I'd mentioned weeks earlier. Not because he was trying to impress me, but because he was paying attention. That was new. I told him early on about my divorce. Not in detail but honestly. I told him I'd spent years feeling invisible and that I was learning how not to disappear again. He didn't rush to reassure me. He didn't offer platitudes. He just said, "Thank you for telling me." That was it. And somehow that was enough. Being with Thomas didn't feel like work. It didn't feel like something I had to earn or manage. I didn't catch myself monitoring my tone or measuring my enthusiasm. I didn't worry about being too much. Because he met me where I was. When I spoke, he listened. When I pulled back, he noticed, but didn't punish me for it. When I showed up fully, he didn't flinch. It startled me at first. I was so used to minimizing myself that being welcomed felt almost suspicious. I kept waiting for the moment I'd have to start editing myself again.
It never came.
That was when I understood how deeply my marriage had trained me to accept less than I deserved. How normal I'd made emotional absence. How often I'd confused effort with love. This was different. Love didn't feel like something I had to prove. It felt like something that existed because we both chose it. There was no imbalance. No chasing. No silent negotiations. Just two people showing up consistently. I thought about Nathan occasionally. Not with anger, but with clarity. The contrast between the two relationships was undeniable. One required me to disappear. The other invited me to exist fully. I didn't feel guilty for moving on. I felt grateful that I hadn't closed myself off entirely. One evening, after Thomas left my apartment, I sat on the couch and realized I wasn't replaying the interaction in my head. I wasn't wondering if I'd said the wrong thing. I wasn't bracing for distance. I was calm. That calm was the surest sign of all. Because love that's healthy doesn't feel like adrenaline. It feels like safety. But as my life finally began to expand, I learned just how differently things had unfolded for the man I once tried so hard to save. I didn't seek out updates about Nathan. They found me anyway. Mutual friends mentioned him in passing. Family members spoke in lowered voices, as if protecting me from something painful. At first, I tried to change the subject. Then I realized I didn't need to.
He wasn't fragile anymore.
Nathan hadn't landed on his feet the way people assumed he would. Without someone quietly organizing his life, things unraveled. He missed deadlines. Let the house fall into disrepair. Drifted between moods he didn't know how to manage on his own. He had believed stability was something you received, not something you maintained. That misconception cost him more than a marriage. I heard he'd lost his job after repeated absences. That he'd moved into a small apartment he complained was too quiet. That he tried dating, but nothing lasted longer than a few weeks. None of it brought me satisfaction.
Just understanding.
I'd spent years acting as his emotional infrastructure. Without me, the gaps became visible. Not because I'd left, but because they'd always been there. There were moments I felt a flicker of sadness for him. For the version of himself that might have existed if he'd been willing to look inward sooner. But sadness isn't the same as responsibility. I reminded myself of that often. Meanwhile, my life continued to expand. My apartment felt like home in a way the house never had. Friends gathered there on weekends. Laughter filled rooms that once felt sterile. I stopped explaining my choices to people who questioned why I'd left a perfectly good marriage. I didn't owe anyone a justification. Thomas remained steady. Not intense, not distant. Just present. We built things slowly, intentionally. There was no rush to define or label what we were becoming. We didn't need to prove anything. One evening, sitting together on my balcony, I told him about the photo album. About being told my love was embarrassing. He listened quietly. Then he said, "That says more about his limits than your heart." I held on to that sentence. Because it reframed everything. My love had never been the problem. It had just been given to someone who didn't know how to receive it. I thought back to the woman I'd been. Apologetic, hopeful, shrinking. I didn't judge her anymore.
He understood her.
She did the best she could with what she knew at the time. And when she learned better, she chose differently. That mattered. I stopped feeling guilty for thriving. Stopped wondering if my happiness somehow diminished his chances of growth. It didn't. Growth isn't borrowed. It isn't transferred. It's chosen. Nathan would either choose it or not. And for the first time, that choice wasn't mine to manage. Looking back, I finally understood the truth that changed everything. And it had nothing to do with him at all. I didn't seek out updates about Nathan. They found me anyway. Mutual friends mentioned him in passing. Family members spoke in lowered voices, as if protecting me from something painful. At first, I tried to change the subject. Then I realized I didn't need to.
He wasn't fragile anymore.
Nathan hadn't landed on his feet the way people assumed he would. Without someone quietly organizing his life, things unraveled. He missed deadlines. Let the house fall into disrepair. Drifted between moods he didn't know how to manage on his own. He had believed stability was something you received, not something you maintained. That misconception cost him more than a marriage. I heard he'd lost his job after repeated absences. That he'd moved into a small apartment he complained was too quiet. That he tried dating, but nothing lasted longer than a few weeks. None of it brought me satisfaction.
Just understanding.
I'd spent years acting as his emotional infrastructure. Without me, the gaps became visible. Not because I'd left, but because they'd always been there. There were moments I felt a flicker of sadness for him. For the version of himself that might have existed if he'd been willing to look inward sooner. But sadness isn't the same as responsibility. I reminded myself of that often. Meanwhile, my life continued to expand. My apartment felt like home in a way the house never had. Friends gathered there on weekends. Laughter filled rooms that once felt sterile. I stopped explaining my choices to people who questioned why I'd left a perfectly good marriage. I didn't owe anyone a justification. Thomas remained steady. Not intense, not distant. Just present. We built things slowly, intentionally. There was no rush to define or label what we were becoming. We didn't need to prove anything. One evening, sitting together on my balcony, I told him about the photo album. About being told my love was embarrassing. He listened quietly. Then he said, "That says more about his limits than your heart." I held on to that sentence. Because it reframed everything. My love had never been the problem. It had just been given to someone who didn't know how to receive it. I thought back to the woman I'd been. Apologetic, hopeful, shrinking. I didn't judge her anymore.
He understood her.
She did the best she could with what she knew at the time. And when she learned better, she chose differently. That mattered. I stopped feeling guilty for thriving. Stopped wondering if my happiness somehow diminished his chances of growth. It didn't. Growth isn't borrowed. It isn't transferred. It's chosen. Nathan would either choose it or not. And for the first time, that choice wasn't mine to manage. Looking back, I finally understood the truth that changed everything. And it had nothing to do with him at all. It took a long time for the truth to fully settle in. Not the dramatic kind you realize in a single moment, but the quieter one that reveals itself slowly, through peace instead of pain. The truth was this. I hadn't failed at love. I had abandoned myself trying to save something that never wanted to be equal. For years, I believed love was something you proved. That if you stayed long enough, gave enough, bent enough, eventually it would be returned in the same measure. I thought endurance was loyalty. I thought silence was maturity. I thought shrinking was compromise. None of that was true. Love doesn't ask you to disappear.
It doesn't reward suffering.
It doesn't grow stronger because one person carries all the weight. I wish I had known that earlier. Not so I could leave sooner, but so I could have stopped blaming myself. I replayed memories differently now. Moments I once analyzed for what I'd done wrong revealed a pattern I'd refused to name. Every time I asked for connection and was met with indifference. Every time I softened my needs so he wouldn't feel pressured. Every apology for emotions that were never unreasonable. I wasn't too much. I was simply with someone who wanted less. That distinction changed everything. I started talking about my experience more openly. Not to vent, but to understand it. Other women nodded when I spoke. Some cried. Some admitted they were living versions of the same story. I never. Still hoping effort would be enough. Told them what to do. I just told them what it cost me to stay. Because staying isn't always strength. Sometimes it's fear dressed up as commitment. I stopped romanticizing potential. Stopped falling in love with who someone could be if only they tried harder. Potential doesn't build a life. Consistency does. I learned to listen to discomfort instead of explaining it away. That tight feeling in your chest? It's information.
The exhaustion?
A signal.
The quiet resentment you tell yourself is normal?
It isn't. Love should feel expansive, not constricting. The most surprising part was how my sense of self returned once I stopped negotiating it.
I trusted my instincts again.
I spoke without rehearsing. I said no without apologizing. I asked for what I wanted without bracing for rejection. And when rejection came, because sometimes it does, I no longer took it as proof of my inadequacy. It was just clarity. I didn't regret my marriage anymore. It taught me what neglect looks like when it wears familiarity. It showed me how easy it is to confuse comfort with connection. And it forced me to confront the cost of self-abandonment. Those lessons were painful. But they were honest. If I could speak to the woman I was then, standing in that kitchen holding a gift meant to be cherished, I wouldn't tell her to leave. I'd tell her this.
Your love is not embarrassing.
Your needs are not unreasonable. And anyone who makes you feel small to feel secure is not your partner. She would figure out the rest in time. Just like I did. And once I truly believed that, I finally understood why walking away wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning. For a long time, I thought leaving was the hardest part. I was wrong. Leaving was an action. Choosing myself every day afterward was a practice.
A quiet, Intentional one.
There were moments, small, unexpected ones, where old instincts resurfaced. Times I almost apologized for taking up space. Moments I caught myself over-explaining a boundary that didn't require justification. Habits formed over years don't disappear overnight. But now, I noticed them. And noticing was power. I began measuring my life differently. Not by how useful I was to others, but by how present I felt within myself. Not by how much I gave, but by whether giving was mutual. The shift was subtle, but permanent. Love, I learned, is not something you chase until someone finally turns around. It's something that walks beside you without being dragged. It doesn't demand proof. It doesn't punish honesty. It doesn't require self-erasure to survive. That understanding changed the way I moved through the world. I stopped tolerating half-effort. Stopped excusing emotional absence. Stopped interpreting neglect as independence. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. And clarity has a way of filtering everything that doesn't belong. My relationship with Thomas continued to grow. Not dramatically, not urgently. Just steadily. We showed up for each other in ways that felt natural, not transactional. There was no scorekeeping. No imbalance disguised as compromise. When conflict arose, it didn't feel threatening. It felt navigable. We talked. We listened. We adjusted. That alone felt revolutionary. But even if that relationship hadn't worked out, I knew something fundamental had changed. I was no longer building my life around someone else's capacity to love me. I was building it around my own capacity to honor myself. And that made all the difference. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about the house I'd left. The marriage that had once felt like my entire identity. The version of myself who believed endurance was noble and longing was just part of love. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt distance. The kind that comes from growth. Walking away didn't make me cynical. It made me discerning. I didn't stop believing in love. I stopped believing love required suffering. That distinction reshaped everything. I no longer needed validation to feel whole. I no longer needed someone else to recognize my worth for it to exist.
I che ridi tu with me?
Quietly. Confidently. Unapologetically. And when I finally looked back without pain, I realized the most important love story had never been about him at all. For a long time, I thought my marriage was the defining chapter of my life.
The beginning.
The middle.
The thing everything else revolved around.
But distance has a way of correcting perspective. When I finally looked back without anger or longing, I saw the truth with startling clarity. That relationship wasn't the story. It was the lesson. The real love story was quieter. Slower. Stronger. It was the one where I stopped betraying myself to keep someone else comfortable. The one where I learned that devotion without reciprocity isn't romantic. It's erasure. The one where I finally understood that being chosen starts with choosing yourself. I still light candles at dinner. I still plan thoughtful gestures. I still love deeply and express it openly. The difference is this. My love is no longer offered as proof of worth. It's shared as a gift. Freely, mutually, and without fear. The woman I am now doesn't apologize for wanting connection. She doesn't minimize her needs to appear easy. She doesn't stay quiet to avoid conflict that reveals truth. She trusts herself. That trust didn't come from confidence. It came from experience. From staying too long. From leaving. From rebuilding. From realizing that loneliness inside a relationship is far more damaging than solitude on your own. I used to believe love was about endurance. Now I know it's about alignment. About being met. About being seen. About being valued without negotiation. If someone requires you to be smaller to stay, that isn't love, it's convenience.
And you will never confuse the two again.
Sometimes I think about the moment it all shifted. The kitchen. The candles. The gift meant to be cherished. I no longer feel embarrassment for that version of myself.
I feel compassion.
She loved earnestly. She hoped bravely. She stayed longer than she should have because she believed in loyalty, commitment, and effort. Those weren't flaws. They just needed direction. And now, they're pointed inward first, where they belong.
My life isn't perfect.
No life is. But it's honest. It's spacious. It's built on choice instead of obligation. And that makes every part of it lighter. I don't measure success by whether someone else stays anymore. I measure it by whether I do. Because the most important relationship you will ever have is the one you carry with you every single day.
And once you stop abandoning yourself, everything else begins to align naturally.
Walking away didn't break me. It returned me. And that's the ending I never knew I was allowed to choose.